Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I have a very special guest today with me, and I'm excited to introduce him here in just a second. But today we're going to be discussing game development and how that kind of corresponds with the Web3 industry. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce you, Ed. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you've already accomplished in the Web3 space and the gaming space as well, and what you're working on now.
Thanks for doing this. I'm Edd Norris. I started my career in game development, working on Nintendo Wii titles, and for the Iron Chef America and some kind of shovelware type family fun games. And then I worked on a couple of I think like 12 casino gambling front end games out of Vegas, and from there worked on a small indie project that didn't get to launch. From there worked on a bunch of marketing. I had a small window of time where I stopped working on games and was working in special education. And then I went back to working on software development around marketing and interactive experiences. And after that, worked on for a couple big companies, and decided to go and kind of run my own office for software development. And that's kind of how I stumbled into some hackathons and Web3 type stuff. And then from there started a trustless team with my buddy Isaac, and Schwab, and we worked on Fish Fight for Harmony and for ourselves. And since then I've just been kind of working on another sort of startup initiative, and that's pretty much where I am today.
Awesome, man. And that's exactly why we're having this conversation, because you are the perfect person to talk to about this.
Hmm.
I think that you have a lot of great ideas as far as Web3 goes in the gaming sector. So I wanted to pick your brain a little bit. And just so everybody knows out there, Ed doesn't know any of these questions. I didn't send him any of these questions that I'm about to ask him. So I'm going to put him on the spot here, and I'm hoping that he gives us some awesome answers. I know he will. So um, let's just roll in with the questions. So the first
No
question.
pressure. No pressure.
Yeah,
No pressure. But it's gonna be amazing.
yeah.
Go ahead.
The first question that I have for you, man, is why do you think gaming and crypto can come together when the majority of the gamers have shown that they aren't interested in NFTs or crypto being introduced into the games that they play?
That's a good question. I think, largely the idea that gamers aren't interested in NFTs, I think has a lot to do with how NFTs are sold to people. Not like technically how they're sold, but why people buy into it, and then the kind of um, mechanisms that make people want to be involved with NFTs. I think, largely what gamers want um, isn't really like what they often buy. Like what they say they want isn't often what they buy. And so what you end up with is like people who love video games and love to play video games, and even celebrate the culture in one way or another. But they don't make games, and they don't work on the technology behind it. They don't sell games to people. They don't make like trailers for games. They don't really deal with the industry, but they're very passionate. Um, and so I think on the sales space of what NFTs and on what the technology behind like self sovereignty comes in is not really like um, who NFTs are primed to be aimed at. I think NFTs and self sovereignty is something that gamers effectively want. They just don't. They don't like the sales pitch. I think that the
Right.
technology. The technology is there to make their lives better, to give them more, you know, essentially the ability to move and keep their efforts, you know, localized to them, so that they can actually take the effort from one game and bring it to another. And, you know, getting that to happen isn't going to be like overnight. Um, but largely, I think that the reason that gamers will want what they can get from blockchain is more about how we can package it and how we can give it to them, but in not focusing on having them become, you know, Web3 evangelists. You know, giving them what they can get from it, but not having them become engrossed in the Web3 ecosystem that people kind of choose to join or not. Um,
So like
but
the
yeah,
speculation aspect of it,
yeah,
essentially.
yeah. I think, you know, TF2, you know, revolutionized to some aspect of this with the way they did their items and crates. Um,
Yes.
and so I think that the argument that, and even so much as like Pokemon Go, you know, essentially requires that you trust that they're doing it fairly. And largely, you know, I would not be surprised if some aspect of how they're doing it fairly is similar to how a blockchain would function. They're just running it themselves. Now, if, you know, if Pokemon Go's, the Pokemon company decided not to keep working on Pokemon Go, then it's over. You know, it's done. Nobody from the community can be like, no, but we want to keep playing. It's not up to them. And so I think that's something that is acceptable today, but by the time we're old, it won't be acceptable because it doesn't need to be that way. These things that people put their time into are as much owned by the community as they're owned by anyone. And so, yeah, I think that it'll become more obvious once you have an example where this is going on, where the power of blockchain can actually keep a community together. Where without it, it leaves people vulnerable to business operational costs, to just the interests of whoever's in charge of the company. And so, yeah, you've seen this time and time again where, you know, even like the original Halo servers went down and
Yeah.
people stayed online in the maps just being like, no, I'm not leaving. And
Yeah.
eventually the servers went down. But that if they were up to the community to just pay for it, it could still be up today.
Right. That's a great answer, man. I think that really solidifies like the idea of what it is that we're trying to build here in Web3, but not yet achieved.
Yeah.
So, my next question that I have for you is, what aspect of blockchain technology do you think will play the most pivotal role in the future of gaming?
Mm. Um, Pivotal role. I mean, that's an interesting question just around like to whom. I think that will want people. I think people will grow to want verification of randomness in ways that they don't currently worry about. I mean, not to harp on Pokemon Go, but I mean they are a Skinner box, and a little bit of like a random chance game, and you just kind of trust that it works fairly. But there's lots of examples of centralized businesses that are believed to work fairly, and you know, just one random intern turns that up on its head because the security checks aren't really expected to be needed to be so robust. I think that exact thing happened. I think like 2 years ago with the Pokemon trading cards. Someone who worked at a distribution center just
Yeah.
started taking rare cards off the assembly line, and
Yep.
they were not in the packs. And for a year, they're just like, "There's not any of these in the pack," and so they just thought they were super rare. But then suddenly somebody shows up at a game store and was like, I got all these rare cards. Like, these is like 1,000% odds that you would have one of these, then you have all of them. And it's like, oh, don't worry about it. Like, I
Yeah.
think that's where we'll become. A lot of people, rightfully think of games as like recreational, not a big deal. But for a lot of these things, it's a time commitment that people put into. And to me, it feels like that time commitment cannot be, uh, degraded by not taking it seriously. And so, yeah, I think that there's a value that comes from that, and that's just where what will become like one of the biggest things that blockchain can kind of do for gaming.
So
Yeah,
for example, you're referring to like Chainlink's VRF, correct?
yeah, or there's a couple of them, but yeah,
Yeah. There are other oracles out there and things like that people can use, but like that's just one prime example.
exactly, yeah, that's an example.
Okay. Cool. Um my next question for you, because I'm just gonna keep spouting them off to you. How long do you think it will take gamers to catch on that ownership of assets like skins are a good thing? Because like I go on Reddit all the time, even though I know I shouldn't, because it's nothing but a cesspool at this point. But all I ever see them talking about is how they view NFTs as this cash grab for game studios, which it could be that. But like when I think of NFTs, right, I think
Mhm.
that if the game developers were to use royalties on NFTs, like let's say a 5% royalty fee on resales,
Mhm.
could they not substitute that instead of like an annual game pass that a lot of games use right now?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the cesspool aside, the question of the financial models that are used on games and are successful for games um, are not equatable to the vocal minority in gaming. I think like free to play is an excellent example. There's a great democratization of gaming when you have a free to play model where you get so many people that are able to just play these games and not spend any money and enjoy them. And then there are people who want to play them in a different way and they can spend money and it works out. I think more than that, like there's an aspect too of you look at the thousands and thousands of digital creators that have become supported by the people who actually enjoy their creations. And I think the same is true about game development. That there's a lot of indie game developers that I know that just they can't necessarily get the attention because of their marketing budget or because of whatever it is about, like, even if they're just like a niche at what they're trying to do, they can't get the amount of people to see it to hit uh, that nexus of being super financially successful. But if they can find a way to find a small group of people who are supportive of their project, then that changes the dynamic around how they can create what they want to create and get supporters for. It's the same thing that happened with like niche cultural hubs that happen online, is that the internet opened us up to be able to have like edge cases on what people want to be involving themselves in and how they can be supported more directly. And yeah, I think it's just about opening up the realm of who is it for, and that has not been effectively communicated because largely the mainstream would have you believe that like Bored Apes Yacht Club is is a good example of
Yeah.
how NFTs can work. It's an
Yeah.
example, but I don't think it's a good example of how NFT projects can empower their creators, empower their community, empower, even just the idea of creation. So yeah, I don't think it's, you're not going to please everybody, but that's sort of the point, giving people an option to be pleased in the way that they want to be, that I think will be a nexus point for gaming when they can prove we're here for our community. We don't really need to have
Right.
everybody be satisfied. And if you want to buy the game for a $60 ticket price, um, I mean, technically that can work with uh, something like a Game Pass. Like if you pay to buy the game for a year, whatever it is, you can still do that with some kind of an NFT or a tokenization of access to the game. But then you have the ability to resell it. You have
Right.
this ability to
Right.
transfer it. You have the ability to use it on a different platform based on how the developer wants to set it up. And so it's just self sovereignty applied to this other media lens or media structure.
Awesome. Awesome answer.
Hmm.
So next question that I have for you is there a way to develop games right now that introduces blockchain to the back end of these games without the gamers knowing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the future of gaming for as far as blockchain. Blockchain is really just, spreading around where the data is handled. And so largely it's a fool's errand to try to get every gamer to be a blockchain user or a crypto enthusiast. Like it's just not practical, but not just because of like cultural norms and differences, but also just like the onboarding process is arduous. Like it doesn't make sense for if you want to, oh, do you like games? Well, let me tell you about math and let me explain to you how keys work. Like
Yeah.
it's not smart. I think the One Wallet is a good example of like a direction on how that makes sense, where it's just an open software protocol that allows for a Google Authenticator to replace private keys, which I think is still a little clumsy because it has so much of the account ownership and security needing to be trained into the player, which I think it's unnecessary. I mean, largely, you know, when you're talking about games versus money, it's a big difference between how secure you need to be. Um, like for instance, like if you wanted to use, a cloud backup for your account on your phone, so you're playing like some random game on your phone, you can create an account on that device that makes it so that device is essentially the only one that knows that it's you, but it is a unique identifier. It makes it so that it is just you. Then you can transfer that user's account almost like how you used to with like an NES cartridge.
Yeah.
You can basically just send that around in a QR code between phones, or you could do it in some one way or another, like copy pasting it between Apple devices. Um, there's lots of ways that you can have that. It does require the developers for the project to get behind the concept, which I think they would. I mean, they just want to bring people games and they want to make it as easy for their user to jump in. But yeah, it basically shifts the dynamic between how do you get people to use blockchain without having to learn about blockchain. You teach the developers that are making the games how to work that into their backend so that the users don't even know, and they're just getting all the benefits and removing a lot of the headache and all of the. I don't know. It's almost like knowledge bloat. Like if you don't need to know, that's what makes like something like an Apple device really elegant. Is there's this sense of like, yeah, it just works. It should just
Yeah.
work.
Exactly. 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 Dude, you like read my mind because you literally answered my next question. I was going to ask you at this stage of Web3 gaming, how can we not only ensure the security of gamers, but also make sure that it's user friendly for them?
Yeah,
And you literally just answered that question for me in both senses
yeah,
because that's the security aspect of, we can use these systems that are already in place to ensure
yeah.
security while also making sure that it's easy to onboard these users.
Yeah, I think there's one thing I'd add to that would be that there's a difference between, the World of Warcraft character you've been playing for years and some random, indie game you decided to play once in a while. And
Sure.
so if you're a gamer and you're investing a certain number of hours into a game, there's a point where, amongst your friends and this culture of this game, this community of this game, it would make sense for you to talk to each other and say, like, yeah, you should back up your save file. You should back up access to your account and put it somewhere safe, and like get into the nitty gritty of like how nerdy blockchain can be. Put it on a piece of paper and like put it in a safe, and then no one can steal your account. That kind of thing starts to make sense when you're talking about like some level 60 character that you've been, loving and living as for years, but not all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, man, I love it. I love it. So give me an example, because you are an indie developer. Give me an example of how indie game developers out there can utilize blockchain to cut down on some of their overhead.
Yeah. So, indie game developers, indie game developers often will create lots and lots of little games that don't get the attention that they deserve, and don't, allow for the developer to take off what they're doing and make a sizable income from their work. A lot of the time they end up doing that for a while because they care and they're devoted to just the creative art of game development. Um, and so what that ends up with is like several games that have a few hundred, a few thousand users, and essentially, uh, a monthly server cost to keep them online if they're doing any kind of hosting, if they're doing match like online play, or if they're doing any even like high scores and things like that. Um, and there's ways that you could sort of aggregate this as a business, and a lot of indie game developers are basically one and or two people, that kind of collaborate in one way or another. A handful of contractors occasionally, but largely it's one or two main staff. And so, if you're lucky, then one of them will be a back end developer, and they will set up some kind of server, maybe even run it out of their house. But if they're not lucky, they're going to end up using some sort of mainstream big tech solution that either sell has it so that the account model will have to be updated and they'll have to continually work with Apple or Google to use it, or they'll have their own like AWS solution, and then it's project and they'll be operating fun. But largely, that's kind of where it's problematic to be a small game developer, an indie game developer, where you're having to, I mean, from my experience, the desirability of these projects is you want to complete them, put them out there, and have them exist in a sort of crystal form, kind of like how the old console games used to be able to come out, where you might fix a bug, you might do a thing here or there, you might even have like downloadable content that comes through, but that won't be expected, and so what you end up with right now is you have to run your online aspect of a game perpetually in order for it to continue to be just accessible. And so one of the things that blockchain can kind of do is come into that equation, find a stable network that can facilitate the same data on the back end, and actually make it easier for a single or double person team to just have access to perpetual data, without having to run their own server, without having to give up security or privacy to big tech names, and even then still pay fees. And then, yeah, you get to this place where you can pay essentially by the number of users. And so if you have one or two or five games that you come out with over a number of years, um, the third or fourth or fifth game starts to pop get popular, then you'd end up with a situation where the cost would be comparable to dealing with running your own servers at that point. Once you had a popular game, it'd be about comparable to paying it for your own servers. But for the first few years, when you're really trying to get that retention, it would cost next to nothing to have just a handful of users that you have using this full-fledged service, and you wouldn't have to worry about it like becoming sunsetted. So like if you made those first early games, you have like a handful of diehard game fans, and all of a sudden you get to like game 3 and you have to turn off game 1 servers. Now you're creating bad press for yourself just because your costs aren't exactly where you need them to be. And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely a cost benefit, but there's also just like letting developers focus on like making games rather than hosting content and dealing with back end service development. Yeah.
That is a great answer, man. And that's clearly something that I asked for a very specific reason, because you wouldn't happen to know anything about that sort of stuff, would you?
No, it's honestly, it's one of the things that beyond just what I've become interested in blockchain, it's also something that's shut down some of my game projects before. Like I've worked on multiplayer kind of simple games and basically just kind of realized like I don't really want to deal with the I don't want to deal with the consequences of having to run servers and deal with online multiplayer things. And this game isn't really as fun when it's single player. I think it really wants to be a multiplayer game, but you know, I don't really want to have to worry about running servers forever. So I'm just going to shelf it. And I think that's not what people want. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
man. I love it. And I think that that is the future of blockchain gaming, but gaming in general as well.
Yeah.
There's definitely a market there for that, and I think that that could be an awesome B2B model in the future. But my last question that I want to ask you before we wrap up here is, how could Web3 potentially make games in the future more immersive?
Immersive. I think an interesting thing jumps out when you ask about that is talking about um like the cross pollination between games that's really difficult currently. That essentially the way that we play games right now is largely localized to the game itself, and that's lacking in some ways. I think there's even like a clear space where people are drawn to the alternative, like Marvel versus Capcom comes to mind, where we have
Yeah,
two like
yeah,
genre blending or even just like brand blending games, and they're fun. It's really fun to see these two different universes messing with each other and seeing how they combat. I think that's an immersive aspect. I think really though, like when you buy a piece of content, and I think you were asking a question earlier about like when will things shift around like self like ownership of, and when will gamers like kind of shift their thinking. I think that like people who grew up playing Fortnite are gonna sort of feel the same way as those people who grew up like buying Nintendo in the Nintendo stores. Like
yeah,
if you're gonna want to be like, I already bought this game. Why do I have to buy it again? Because I bought the new Wii U or the Switch. It's like that. There's gonna be a point where people are going to just want to be able to keep that equity that they put in, um, and they should. And I don't think developers are really trying to shut that down. The like largely Tim Sweeney or the guys at Epic seem to be um, cognizant of V-Bucks are a valuable part of their business, and
yeah.
making people feel good about those expenditures in perpetuity. I think it just feels like the path towards a more immersive experience. Um, but I think there's another side of it of just like um, proofs and verification of like when a game happens. No one wants to be cheated. I think like I'm a big fan of Dark Souls and that whole franchise. And one of the biggest things about it is the sense that when something goes wrong, it feels like it's your fault, not the game's fault.
Right.
And like that's a really, I don't know if immersive is the exact right word, but there's a point of like if you start to play a game and it feels like it's not fair, you're gonna stop playing. And so there's just this feeling of like blockchain can kind of prove that things happened and they were agreed upon beyond just your computer and his computer or their computer, that there's actually an intermediary that's saying like, no, it was fair and here's how. And like, this is the data that came in from you and him in this time frame and this time frame. And it's not like, yeah. And there's also that aspect of like, especially like Twitch style games, not Twitch, the TV or the streaming service, but like Marvel versus Capcom or a game like Battle crap. What's the
Like fighting style games?
Yeah, Smash Bros. Or Smash Bros. Excuse me.
Yeah.
So like,
Okay.
there's so much of that's just like people contending that it wasn't fair one way or another. And I think that's going to be, it'll make it so people can really feel good about the games that they're playing and the time that they're putting in. And yeah, I think that'll make it feel, worthwhile in a way that it currently is maybe lost on people.
So just so like everybody in the audience is clear, whenever you talk about cross-pollination, you're talking about this idea that similar to like crossplay, the way that you can connect an Xbox player against a PlayStation player, you're talking about connecting one game that has absolutely no affiliation with another game out there. So like, let's say the creators of Halo, Bungie, linked up Halo with their current franchise, Destiny, and players in Halo and Destiny. That's what you're referring to, correct?
Yeah, I mean something like that. I think largely. So this is where it gets interesting. I think that what will make the future more interesting for gamers is that right now there are these sort of legacy behemoths like Halo and Destiny, and they may not want to blend their brands in one way or another. But you'll have these smaller businesses, smaller companies that will be more open to cross-pollinating. And I think that it'll separate the value proposition that smaller businesses can offer, where you will see the ability for them to be like, okay, we've sold access to the game, we've given you this character, and technically, you could take it anywhere. We think you should keep it in, these metaverses, but the structure and the way that it's set up would allow for you to take it anywhere. And that model will mean that it's essentially capable. It's like the same thing that happens with like, cult movies versus mainstream movies, is that there's a certain like culture that can form around it because people can connect to it in a different way. They can feel like they're a part of it more than say like a Halo or something that's more owned and controlled by bigger brands for the reasons that they might have found reasons to want to close it off, but that will become a trade-off that they have to make. Whereas now no one else is really able to do it effectively. So it'll create a different future, and they'll have to choose whether or not they want to be a part of it.
I love that, man. I love that answer. And honestly, like, I think that this has been one of my favorite conversations when it comes to the Web3 gaming industry, because a lot of people aren't willing to have these hard conversations because like they don't want to talk about the fact that gamers don't like Web3 games. They don't want to talk about the fact that they don't want to touch NFTs. Like it's a hard conversation to have, but it's necessary, I believe, that we have these conversations because we need to be thinking in the mind of a gamer, not in the mind of a blockchain evangelist. So, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this conversation before we wrap it up?
Hmm. Yeah, I think generally it's just it's a pleasure to kind of talk about these things. I think that largely I um just want games to be about the players and the fun that can be had. And largely, you know, there's aspects of the current gaming industry that get in the way of fun, that get in the way of people being able to cut loose and be adventurous. Um, and I'm just looking forward to how the future can be more autonomous and more even anonymous in a way that isn't really safe for gaming because people are crazy in one way or another.
Yeah.
But there should be a way for people to toggle whether or not they want to engage with the real aspects of humanity or not, and say like I don't want, unless someone's willing to put their identity in some way on the line. I don't want to interact with them. That's what the current model basically does. And for some people that's what you want. You want things to be less um you know crazy. But there's a certain aspect. It's a game. We're playing with each other, and that to me feels like we need a space to do it. And so, yeah, I just hope that blockchain and the technology can kind of show up and make games as free and fun as they can be, and find new and interesting ways to provide value to developers, so they can keep making the things that they want to make, find their niche, build their communities and their fan base. And yeah, I think that blockchain can do that. And so I look forward to that. And I hope, that I'm not alone.
You're not, man. You're not, because I'm on the same page with you, man. And I know that there are a lot of other people out there that are thinking the same things. So again, thank you so much for joining me today, Ed. I really appreciate this conversation, and I look forward to having some more conversations in the future with you.
You got it. Thanks, man. It's always good to talk to you, Clay.
You too, man.